Let's talk ADHD with Alex High. And today, Dominic Velando. Dom and I met back in 2018 at my first ADHD conference in St. Louis. I believe it was Dom's first conference too.
Yes.
And we met through Ryan Mayer, who's also been on the show. So, Dom, it's great having you here.
It's nice talking to you again, man. It was cool seeing you over the weekend. It's been a minute. Glad everybody's
Yeah.
home and safe.
Yeah. It's good. Dom was just referring to the ADHD coaches retreat for which Dominic was the unofficial
Support, we'll say.
official ride from the airport guy. So yeah, it was great seeing him, and it was great catching up. So and it just inspired me. I got to get him on the show. So to get things started, Dom, what is your ADHD story?
I would say that the overall theme would be there's a lot of duality to my story. There's always a yin yang. There's always sometimes it's a dance, sometimes it's a fight, but there are always like a couple different forces at work. And I think that's probably the most that's how I'd like to approach it. And I mean, there's so many different chapters to my story, like with all of us. So, but hopefully that kind of gives an overview of it's just always kind of been, like for instance, sometimes with ADHD, a lot of the stuff is unseen, invisible, intangible. And then there's a whole other thing going on. And to get a little more specific, so growing up, I was constantly not in class. And the reason is because I was either in detention or I was in the gifted and talented classroom,
Mhm.
which was, as you can imagine, very confusing. Proved to be very confusing for the rest of my life because it was like, okay, so am I special? Am I a bad kid? And it was kind of hard to reconcile both of those things because I think there was some truth to both of it. I mean, I was definitely very disruptive and hyperactive as a kid. I mean, in a lot of ways, I was a little bit of a problem child. Luckily, it never, I never went down like a road of getting into, real troublemaking or get in trouble with the law or anything like that, as a lot of us do. I was very fortunate in that sense, but also maybe it's because I had a little bit of that grounding from being recognized as like, hey, you got some creativity and you got some things going for you that we'd like to cultivate. But there was no ADHD diagnosis in 1989, for example, when I would have been 5 years old. That's when I started school. And right away, though, it was like kind of chaotic in that sense that a lot of people just didn't know what to do with me. But then they also sometimes knew exactly what to do with me because they're like, oh, well, this kid sees things and perceives things sometimes on a more advanced level, which is not to say that like being ADHD inherently goes with being highly creative but sometimes it does. And that was very much the case with me, particularly without any kind of assistance in terms of like accommodations or support or acknowledgement of, hey, maybe you're not a bad kid. It was definitely confusing. And I would say that, and so I'll give you another example just to kind of give you an idea of who I am in my story. So, Pops was a special education teacher in the same school as me. All of this stuff went completely under the radar, though. A lot of people, I think they just looked at the results and what was obvious to them, which is that Dominic has a hard time sitting still and being impulsive and, ostensibly is sometimes just very lazy and disorganized and doesn't care and disrespectful and all this, that, and the other. That, I mean, some of that is certainly true. So some of the things some of the ways I would engage in class might have been rude, also hilarious. Also sometimes utterly like I even back looking back, it's like it was pretty funny. Sometimes sometimes even teachers were like, like they knew it was funny. They knew that like my disruption was there was a keen insight to it. I was, kind of considered myself a little bit of a comedic guy. I'm not saying I'm a comedian, but with comedy, sometimes there's an insight, isn't there?
Mhm.
Sometimes it's insight people don't like. And sometimes it's just something that you don't really speak out every single day. But when you're a kid who just kind of says what they want to say, does what they want to do, in spite, doesn't really have a lot of insight into or foresight, I should say, into consequences sometimes. But yeah, I was at a timing for that. I was at like a comedic and disruptive timing that, I mean, sometimes I was just making an impact, but just in ways that were really challenging for people to figure out, because it's like, okay, so we stuck you in a room with the bad kids for 2 days and you didn't get to participate and you didn't seem to learn, because here you are again. But then also, you show some promise and you do some cool stuff that was valuable. And so then we support that. Maybe I would express some kind of creative talent and they'd say, hey, do you want to read aloud? You remember that? Like,
Hmm.
there's a big part of school growing up is that everyone takes turns reading, and some kids, they volunteer for, like, hey, we're going to read through this fictional story. Would anybody like to read this character's part for the class? And so a lot of times I was either volunteering or people would recognize, like, oh, this kid's, got some talent for being articulate and for getting into character and performing and whatnot. But I tell you, man, the ADHD diagnosis doesn't clear all of that up like magically, for sure. There's a whole integration process. It's a process, but certainly explained a lot of things. And to this day, I'm kind of the same person, but I think to bring it kind of around full circle a little bit, it's like the ADHD story for me, in a lot of ways, it kind of ended and began with the adult diagnosis.
Mm.
And mind you, I was diagnosed several times throughout life. I never had one particular. I know some people go through like a battery of tests, and maybe there's a clinician involved. I never went through that, but there were clinicians involved for sure, because I took that very seriously. I wasn't going to self-diagnose myself on TikTok. Sorry if that's how you arrived at your diagnosis. Everybody has their own path, but I wanted to be sure,
Hmm.
and I wanted to, I had other stuff going on. I mean, sometimes just mentally traumatizing things that I think sometimes it can present as ADHD. Sometimes you go through stuff in life that is very emotionally just kind of destabilizes you. And, maybe you're just constantly ruminating, or you just have a lot, it's just regularly dysregulating to you, because you haven't brought any closure. So for me, I mean, there's been a lot of therapy for stuff that, may or may not have anything to do with ADHD. But I will say that my story is definitely involved just a lot of trying to sort out, like, why do I sometimes feel like I have this multiple parts to my personality that seem to be fighting, and then my place in society seems to be contradictory sometimes. And I don't think I was really going to be able to bring closure to or clarity to any of that, though, until I really started engaging with what is ADHD and what does it mean to
Mm.
me. And of course, I've since developed like bigger thoughts about ADHD at large and what's going on in the world. But for me, yeah, my ADHD story wasn't the ADHD wasn't even really a part of it to my self-awareness until much later. And then here we are. Now it's kind of like the story has changed.
Mm. In what ways has it changed?
Well, I think the self-awareness of the diagnosis, for one, I mean, I think a lot of us go through that where it's like, oh, that would explain. Or like even people close to you, like maybe your significant other, like, I see. That's why you're kind of crazy in this way, which can be a huge relief to a lot of people, right? It's like, oh, okay. So if I have something going on with my dopamine reuptake, maybe I'm not just a ravenously hungry, just food addicted person. Maybe there's other physiological stuff going on that I can't control. or at least I have to figure out how to control it now that I've established that I'm not just you know, a person with just no limits because I don't care. I bought into a lot of that stuff, man. I certainly did.
Mm.
It- I'm a narrative guy. I've been a storyteller my whole life. I think a lot of ADHDers, that's kind of, it helps us make sense of the world is storytelling and narrative. And I think like the story changing in terms of, okay, my origin story. That's a big thing, even in, like everyday storytelling, from the highest budget movie down to, somebody just telling their story on the street. Everybody kind of has like, a framework and in a way that they engage with their own story. And it really wasn't until I think I was allowed the self-awareness to be like, okay, this is a bigger thing than me, that I could start to kind of separate myself from the narrative that I kind of got attached to, was like, maybe I am a bad person. Maybe I am just a reckless, wild person. Or maybe I mean, dude, sometimes like, at the risk of sounding pretentious, but I share this stuff because maybe other people are going through it. There are demonstrable reasons to believe that I'm not a dummy. I got a brain on me, at least in terms of certain things. I didn't believe that for a long time, man. A long time I went through life and I was just like, like I probably can't do this because I'm not very smart, or I'm just gonna screw it up. Because it's like, once you see a lot of what you're doing come to a conclusion that gets repeated over and over, which is that, maybe you give up on it, or you didn't even know you gave up on it because you were so far afield from getting distracted that you're like, oh yeah, I was doing this a while ago. I mean, from short term, like trying to complete a task, to long term, like trying to chase your dreams. I found it to be really difficult to engage sometimes, when in the narrative in my head is that like there's no escape from who I am. Like, I'm on a track. And I think ADHD diagnosis, relating to people like yourself who are kind of dealing with this out in a public sector, as well as personally, as well as with clients, it's huge, man. It helps reform the narrative. And so for instance, I mean, I think we all go through it, like with the diagnosis thing, especially when it's later in life. Sometimes it can be just so impactful just to be able to relate, just to be able to relate to others. Sometimes you can feel it. It's like my brain is literally rewiring because I don't have to worry about, is it just me anymore? There's other people out there in the world.
So, what was the turning point that made you realize, "Oh, I'm not alone"?
The convention for sure, where we met, that was a big one, man, because I'd been diagnosed kind of informally and also seen a therapist about it, talked to people who are close to me, but it didn't amount to anything. It just all kind of ended up as like you can talk to my parents and they're like, yeah, probably. I'd be like, thanks, mom. Probably got it from you. uh, and honestly, sometimes I think people didn't want to hear about it because it spoke to themselves, right? Like it's there's a strong link between, sometimes it's hereditary, and sometimes people in my family that I found that they're, it's an uncomfortable topic. So sometimes you don't get very far until you experience some of the things I experienced, like in the convention. For one, just being in a like that first convention in St. Louis, I didn't know what I was getting into, but I just knew there were people who I could relate to. And I was kind of messaging back and forth with, like the official Facebook page, the administrators there. And they're like, yeah, 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 you should come in because you'll find pretty much that. Like, you're going to find other people you can talk to, and then you'll find support. Being in a hotel with like basically like 300, 400 people, all with ADHD. And then you're walking around and talking to them, and you're like, oh, you're like me. You talk like me. And then you sit down and tell stories, and you're like, you just told the most embarrassing story of my life, but from your perspective. You already been through it. You get it. The speech patterns, dude. I remember there was a specific moment. You might have been in that little circle. We were kind of in between some like presentations or whatever out in the main lobby, I remember there were like 6 to 8 people all in a circle, and I remember we started on one point, we hit all these it was like Mario doing a platforming, and we
Mm.
went way out, and then we boom, 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 came back around 30 minutes later, and I remember thinking, "Wow, guys, this has been quite an adventure. We made it, and we hit all of the subpoints that everybody some people just generating in mid conversation like, oh wait, I have to tell you about this. People sometimes would give me a little flack about having that kind of conversation style. They're like, why can't you just finish a thought? It's very annoying. I don't, some people will, they won't even address it. They'll just be like, I don't want to talk to you. They don't understand your conversation style. They don't understand why it is that you have to express things sometimes verbally that to them they're like, it's not really worth saying. But that's somehow some of us have to do it. We have to externalize it. That's when I that was one of the moments that really stuck out to me, man. Is I mean, obviously, going to a presentation where there's some kind of expert and they're presenting research, or it's a coach and they're speaking your language and they're talking about their frameworks and people they've all that stuff is great. But I think it really started to click once I just got around a bunch of people who were kind of like me. And then it was just kind of an immersion and it was therapeutic, honestly. Kind of nice.
Yeah, and that's the main reason I keep going back to those conferences. It for me, it's not about learning. I mean, yeah, I learn stuff while I'm there, but the chief reason I'm there is to connect with people. And that's one of the chief reasons I'm doing the Let's Talk ADHD series on YouTube. It's to connect with people.
To your point, I mean that's kind of like how the story kept evolving. Like you saw with, when I was a lot more heavily in the ADHD space, coaching kind of just it was really something else. So I some of you might know me as hyper focused Dom. I was kind of doing my thing like mostly on Instagram, but it was amazing some of the people that would just randomly hit me up just by expressing my story, just
Mm,
by telling my story. And sometimes it was embarrassing. It's like, do I really want to share this with the world? And a lot of people don't get it, but the people who do, it's like sometimes it just lands like crazy. And then sometimes it's like the deeper you dig into your story, and it can be a painful process. I know it was for me. It wasn't always pleasant. It was like stirring up emotions and whatnot and memories. But it's not just like interacting with other, people who are kind of in the public space like yourself, like influencers and coaches, but connecting with, people who follow your stuff
mm.
and sometimes they reach out and they'll tell you about themselves and you're like, wow, there's a connection here. There's like, you couldn't have made this up. I mean, you could have, but sometimes it's just it hits so hard and it's so nuanced to where you're like, yeah, I think you get it. There is something to be said about that, and I think, man, it might be one of the most important things we do, right? As people with ADHD, whether you're a professional working in the space or whether you're just somebody dealing with ADHD on a regular basis, I mean, having a social network is just like a lifesaver sometimes.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it any better than that. So I'm going to move the conversation on because,
Okay.
yeah. So you mentioned you were doing hyper focus Dom. You mentioned you were putting stuff on Instagram and you've kind of taken a step back from that. So what are you doing now and how do you see ADHD coming into play there?
Yeah, man, I just returned to my art and it kind of goes back to like so we talk about my ADHD story. It goes way back, but as I mentioned the awareness, the label, I mean, I never like to be labeled, but sometimes that's just what it is.
Mm.
It's it and that matters because like if you're presenting yourself and you ADHD comes along with your presentation, it's part of who you are. It's part of how you're presenting yourself in the world. I was always very wary of getting too deep into that because as much as like a lot of the neurodivergent population, like this is my tribe, like we understand each other. A lot of people close to me are very much like either neurodivergent or just kind of that kind of personality. Before all this, man, the story is that Dominic was an artist.
Mm.
Uh, Dom was recognized as somebody who took words and pictures and told stories, doing a lot of drawing. And I think that's part of there's an overlap. I mean, probably because I have the kind of brain that I do. I'm wired the way I am. That's part of why I would get really hyper focused on drawing and just highly creative stuff, connecting dots, as we often like to do. It became part of my personality very fast. Like by the time I was like 3 years old, I was getting recognized like, oh, this kid draws and he tells stories and he's just creative. And the art was serving my ADHD coaching business. It was a way to self promote. It was a way to tell my story. It was a way to, you create content sometimes when you're in the business, and in just about any business. A lot of times you're at some point on some kind of platform making stuff to increase your visibility, to reach people. I found that after a while, I was like, I'd like to put this on the back burner now. I'd like the ADHD thing it'll always be part of my story. But my first identity was as a visual artist, as a creative. And so yeah, a lot of my energy has just gone back to that. And when you're in this space, especially if you're trying to, you're going for it and you got a career that you're building, it's like if you deviate too much, as we often do, it can be a problem sometimes. And I really wanted to tell other stories, honestly. I was
Mhm.
out there and everything was kind of ADHD related. Everything, and I had a hashtag ADHD with it. And I just got to a point where I felt like I wanted to kind of reverse the balance and really just start telling stories that, just didn't have anything to do with reaching a certain kind of audience and were more just an authentic expression of myself. And especially because it was kind of this has been kind of a rediscovery process, self discovery, because it's almost like sometimes there's just especially if you're diagnosed with ADHD as an adult, it's like there's almost like a before and after phase to your life because it's so impactful. And so in the process of rediscovering myself, I think it gave me a little bit of my confidence back over the years to where I'm like, you know what? A lot of this stuff I gave up on because I had ADHD and I didn't have answers. So, for example, I remember I'm 40 now. I remember about 20 years ago, I was trying to break into the comics industry. That's what I really grew up on. That's when, way before the Marvel universe and all that, I was reading comics as a little kid in the 80s and 90s. And it was like a rock star profession. It's kind of like one of those things as a kid, you grow up and there's certain professions that just kind of like everybody's just kind of got their mind on like, oh, I want to be an astronaut, I want to be a rock star, I want to be the president, I want to be a comic artist, I wanted to draw superheroes and all that. And I will say, man, that as passionate as I was, as much as I loved it, yeah, just the emotional regulation problems, the distraction, the impulsivity, it really got in the way. And it was confusing to me because I'm like, I kind of knew that part of what made me creative was also what was causing my suffering. It was hard for me to reconcile. And especially after some people this is gonna hit you real hard, but especially after year after year of being like, man, I tried this and then I quit. And then I tried this and then I did something else. And after a while, I started abandoning that dream. And I felt like the dream had abandoned me because the distance had grown. And I never really stopped being creative at all. But yeah, man, it's just when you're going for something and you've got kind of a presentation, especially if it's a combination of who you are and it's professional, everything is kind of comes with, you got to reach an audience, you got to be clear about what it is that you're doing and who you are. And it started getting really difficult for me to sustain like my desire to tell other stories and to be a little more free with my art and just get back to like, who am I as an artist? And so right now, one of the things I'm doing is I'm really attacking my love of animation,
Mm.
which is really a logical extension of the comic thing. like it's been 20 years and the industry's changed and I've changed as a person. So like that dream hasn't died, but it's changed to where it's like, I'm still kind of the same guy. Like I'm 40 years old, but it's like I'm constantly thinking about people flying through the air doing wrestling moves and action movie like flying kicks on each other. That like it hasn't really changed. I've matured in so many different ways, but it's like I'm still obsessed with that stuff. I still think it gives me life. And that's one of the so that's a perfect example of like when I was kind of trying to reconcile it. It's like there's a way to do it, but I decided, you know what? Coaching, ADHD, being in that space, it's always going to be there. And I think I'll always, and I do have a connection, obviously, but because I still, there's lots of people I collected along the way who are in my tribe, who are my favorite people, who I still stay connected to, and they're coaches, they're influencers, they're in the ADHD world. It's very much part of who they are. But yeah, man, right now it's like so in the last 5 years or so, even while I was coaching, while I was doing these things, I was teaching myself how to animate. I was self-educating myself. And now I'm just kind of turning it up a notch in the last year or so. And now I'm really kind of digging into it. And this is a more recent development. Like as of this year, I've really started to dial into, I love to draw the body in motion. I love to draw, I love to depict, I'm a huge MMA fan. I was a martial artist since I was a little kid. I was doing karate when I was like 5 years old. That stuff is part of who I am. And there's certain things I've just wanted to express. And so, yeah, man, I'm hoping that the path that I'm on now, whatever capacity, people are going to start to see and recognize Dom is a guy who's, man, really skilled and passionate and putting out lots of art related to these things. Going back to the superhero stuff, going back to Spider-Man, going back to the very beginning of, what made me excited about the arts, being able to tell stories that are, just kind of have their own kind of thing. The ADHD world sometimes it does get kind of narrow, I think. Sometimes there's just so much obsession about it and like it because it's so comprehensive to your life, it can be like every layer of your life is like it feels like it kind of comes back to the ADHD thing. And to be honest, man, I wanted a little more freedom and I figured we're gonna once again, like I'm always gonna, be who I am. And so I'm always gonna relate to other people with ADHD. I'm always gonna have to be dealing with it, managing it. But I think that's one of the reasons I got into the space in the first place was I mean, it turned into helping people. It turned into telling my story to reach people. But the very beginning of it was I needed help myself. Managing my own life was really tough without the skills, without the coaching, without the accountability, without all the things that you learn throughout this journey. And I think once that started to fall into place and become an intuitive part of my life to where it's like, okay, I've got a lot of these systems in place, the reminders, the accountability buddies. There was a certain point where I guess I decided, you know what? Let me just let this stuff kind of fade to the background. It's still there, but I just got other stories. I got other endeavors that I want to pursue while while I got the time left on this earth.
Yeah, and I love that because what you have hit on in this telling of your story and telling of who you are is that ADHD doesn't define you. Yes, it's part of you, but it's not who you are. Who you are is Dom. And I just love that. And you're spot on when you say that sometimes it gets narrow in the ADHD world where everything is ADHD. You're more than your ADHD if you're watching this video. So, two quick fire questions.
Yeah.
Number one, favorite superhero?
I mean, I really love Batman. Uh, so I'm gonna go with Batman.
Good,
The
that's the correct answer. The very first one of these we released had Mark from the men's ADHD support group, and we
I know
talked
Mark.
Batman because he's a big Batman fan as well. Okay, second rapid fire question is: after this interview is over and it goes on YouTube, Do you want people to hit you up for coaching? Yes or no?
Yes.
You do. Okay.
I do, and the reason being is that it's a balance, man. It's
Mm,
a balance, and I think and mind you, I'm playing that role in my life now.
mm,
It's just not like it's not set up to where go to my Calendly and you book a thing and I'm paying business taxes on it. I was doing that and now it's just, it's like people in my circle, people that I come across who are, maybe younger and I'm always kind of exercising those skills, but it's just like for me it's a balance in that like I think when you're in the coaching industry sometimes it's like you have a certain amount of like you're trying to get clients and
mm,
there's a certain amount of clients you can handle, especially if you want to be able to provide the best of you and
mhm,
have the best relationships. And yeah, man, I would definitely, if anybody's watching this, especially people who are, I've always really I felt like had a great rapport and had great success with people who are highly creative,
mm.
or they know they've got creativity inside them, but there's emotional blocks, or just their ADHD gets in the way. Sometimes it seems intuitive because it's like, oh, you have ADHD, you must be crazy creative, and it's like, well, sometimes things get in the way,
Yeah.
and that's the kind of stuff where I mean, I worked art therapy into my coaching quite a bit. That was always something that just gave me the juice. Like I love the excitement of having people have breakthroughs in terms of expressing themselves and find solutions through art. So yeah, man, anybody who is finding themselves at that kind of crossroads or this is just like landing, yeah, I'm out there on domtv.tv on Instagram, and that's pretty much where I'm living online, otherwise domvelando.com. And yeah, man, I'm not out there like hunting, for clients, but it's just like yourself. Like I love people. I like
Mhm.
connecting with people. And there's always something special about connecting with people that, you just have a things that you relate with on that, it's kind of hard to find.
Yeah, I love that. So if you're interested in more of Dom, head to domtv.tv on Instagram or go to his website, domvelando.com.
Yes,
Check out
sir.
his stuff. Like, even if you're not interested in connecting with him, check out his stuff because he's super talented. And it's been a pleasure having you today. Thank you for joining us, Dom. Any final thoughts?
My final thoughts would be that let's go back to what you were saying earlier. You are not your ADHD. ADHD is a part of who you are. It changes over time, and I think that's a really important consideration for people is that if you look into it, there's stuff that changes about your brain chemistry, physiologically. Certain things, motivate you more than others. Sometimes your life circumstances change. It's a whole adventure, but I think one of the most empowering things that you can do is educate yourself, arm yourself, provide for yourself the education, connect with people, and then don't let that get in the way. Let that support you and turn that weakness into a strength. Turn that thing that you perceive to be a limitation into the reason that you can do it. You can
Mm,
do it. I believe in you.
that's awesome. Thank you so much, Dom. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.